Tolkien notoriously disliked the Chronicles of Narnia, saying, quote, "It is sad that Narnia and all that part of C.S. Lewis's work should remain outside the range of my sympathy." But what isn't well known is that Tolkien had 3 specific reasons for disliking Narnia. Reasons that range from stylistic nitpicks to profound moral disagreements. The first reason is probably the most well known. If you've read any Tolkien, it's not surprising that he was obsessed with creating a mythology that is both elaborate and consistent. He spoke about how he doesn't enjoy, quote, "stories of an imaginary world that have not got any imaginary history." This serious approach to world building clashes with much of Narnia, in which fauns, British children, talking beavers, and Santa Claus
Merry Christmas!
coexist without much history or explanation. He also thought that Narnia's fauns were deeply problematic. Because of Tolkien's serious approach to mythology, he thought that different species should have their own specific natures. But where Tolkien's own elves, men, and dwarves are innately different, there's very little difference between Mr. Tumnus and a human being who just happens to have the lower body of a goat. From Tolkien's perspective, Narnia trivialized the kinds of mythological figures he wanted to legitimize through The Lord of the Rings. But what I love about Tolkien is that he was the first to admit that, quote,
"That is partly out of the fact that I'm a meticulous sort of bloke."
And his nitpicks aren't necessarily some ideal that other authors should strive for. But Tolkien had another criticism that isn't a nitpick. His belief that C.S. Lewis borrowed a suspicious amount from other authors.
Really?
Tolkien called Lewis very impressionable. Too impressionable. At one point telling Lewis that his writing is at his worst when other writers' lines come too near. Tolkien didn't say this without cause. There are several smoking guns to Lewis, if you're feeling generous, borrowing, or if you're less generous, plagiarizing. Lewis himself said, quote, "In literature and art, no man who bothers about originality will ever be original." And while that hint might seem subtle, what isn't subtle is how Lewis borrowed directly from The Lord of the Rings. This is a big claim, but we have good evidence to believe Tolkien felt this way. Lewis's space trilogy includes quotes like, "Numenor, the true West," and "Sir, if they put forth their power, they will unmake Middle-earth." But even beyond these borrowed terms, a mutual friend of Tolkien and Lewis said, quote, he genuinely believed that Lewis had borrowed from his writings, and once went so far as a broad hint of plagiarism. And since Tolkien already dislikes Narnia, I want to say the only thing worse than plagiarism is bad plagiarism. But Tolkien's criticisms actually go further than this. There's a great article written by Josh B. Long that adds an even more personal level to Tolkien's rejection of Narnia. Quote, "Since you ask if I like Narnia, I'm afraid the answer is no. I do not like allegory, and least of all religious allegory. But what makes everything even more confusing is that Narnia isn't an allegory. What it is something Tolkien would have likely found even worse." C.S. Lewis insisted that Narnia is a, quote, "supposal." If you've never heard of a supposal before, it's because Lewis made it up to describe his book. The difference boils down to Aslan not allegorically standing in for Jesus, but just being Jesus in an alternative Bible fan-fiction-y timeline.
In your world, I have another name.
Yeah, got it. Being a Catholic, he already disapproved of how Lewis became what Tolkien described as every man's theologian. And so, from Tolkien's point of view, Narnia dilutes Jesus into a magical lion inside what he already viewed as a mythologically confused, partly plagiarized, fictional world without history but with talking beavers.
Merry Christmas!
And where allegories have at least the pretense of being a story, supposals are much closer to Lewis putting his own words inside Jesus' mouth. And since we already know Tolkien thought Lewis's fauns were illegitimate, we have reason to think he'd have found Lewis's depiction of their own god to be even more inappropriate. But as much as Tolkien disapproved of Narnia, he approved of Lewis as a person. In one of his letters after Lewis's death, he states that he owed him an unpayable debt. Quote, "Not for influence, but sheer encouragement. He was for long my only audience. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. But for his interest and unceasing encouragement for more, I should never have brought The Lord of the Rings to a conclusion. Thanks for watching. I'm really trying to make good stuff, so if you like good stuff, consider subscribing.